So we'll start and people can join in. This is happening. We won't start with a long meditation, but I just want to we'll do some meditation as we go along. But let's just begin by just taking a moment to get in touch with our motivation. This is, from a Buddhist perspective, right? It's the motivation behind an action, or that motivates an action, that determines the karmic energy, force, kind of result of that action. So particularly, we can cultivate, check what our motivation is, cultivate a virtuous motivation. Bodhicitta is said to be the most virtuous of all motives. And then I actually want to start today with by bringing up a we're talking about Buddha nature, right? Buddha potential, and I want to start with the most well-known text on Buddha nature in Buddhism is the Uttaratantra, which means like the Sublime Continuum, or the Uttara is like best, sublime, most exalted, or something, and Tantra, this can be thread or continuum. Talk more about it. There's going to be a series of classes on chapter 1 of that, but just say for now, we're going to use a simile. There are certain similes for Buddha nature in that text. Just jump right to the. So one of them is this. So I'm just going to jump right to the simile to sort of start to explore this topic. And this is the simile that is taught by in this famous Buddhist text by Maitreya. Maitreya says, in the simile, we are like, each of us is like a very poor person, right? So somebody living in poverty. And Maitreya says, and it's like this very poor person lives in a simple kind of rundown house, shack, something like that. And under the floorboards is, the way he says, is an inexhaustible treasure, but the person doesn't know it's there. And Maitreya makes some points about that. He says, and a treasure can't call out, right? Like, so the person's suffering every day, and from poverty in this simile, right? And then Maitreya says, but the treasure can't call out and say, I'm here. Treasure doesn't do that. Think of it like a little box of diamonds or something, right? You can't say, hey, I'm a box of diamonds under your floor. And so the person doesn't know they have this treasure there, right? That could relieve their suffering. And the treasure, and Maitreya makes a point, the treasure is some distance under the earth, right? It's not just laying on, like, it's not laying between the earth and the floorboards. It's sort of under a floorboard and then under some dirt. And so I'm just pausing it. So Maitreya is saying he's using that as a simile for our situation. And I think it's worth sort of contemplating that. So, and what's he saying, right? What he's saying there is that, first of all, that spiritually we're impoverished. That's his first point. That's Maitreya's observation. I remember actually, Buddhist reference, but I remember being struck by this once when Mother Teresa, when she was alive, worked with the poorest of the poor in India, right? And I remember there was a quote, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but basically she said, she made a point, she said, there's also spiritual poverty. And she said, as somebody who worked with the poorest of the poor in India, that she felt that she actually said that. She said that she felt there were poorer people in America spiritually than the folks she was helping in India. I thought that was very striking at the time. I thought, I wonder what she means. What was her experience? So Maitreya is making this observation that we're spiritually impoverished. And then he's saying, we don't know that we have this inexhaustible source of wealth hidden within, right, or underneath. Now, Maitreya makes his point, he says, is, I already said this, right? The treasure can't call out to us on its own, right? That's one point. So, and, metaphor, right? Gold or diamonds can't speak. But what he's getting at there too is that your own Buddha potential, your own spiritual seed can't tell you it's there. And I just want to pause before I say more, but imagine that for a moment, right? Like, to ask ourselves, is that my circumstance? That's what, as a Buddhist teaching, right? Is it true, right, that I have a source of inexhaustible wealth, spiritual wealth within me that I don't know is there? That's what Buddhism's asserting is true, right? Do I feel that way about myself? Would it change something if I felt that way about myself? Would it change something if I felt that way about everybody? Question that Maitreya asked at a certain point. And that's most of what Maitreya says, but I want to elaborate now personally on this metaphor, or that simile, and to ask, like, if somebody, because actually, like, so now, right, in this moment, you say that, like, Maitreya is like a person, where I'm sharing his teaching, right? So it's like Maitreya is now telling us, right, hey, you're this poor person who has an inexhaustible source of wealth hidden within you, right? It could solve all your problems. And I stay with the metaphor of the poor person, right? Like, first, because our reaction, if you check yourself, right, your reaction may be, I don't believe that, right? Like, the poor person might say, if somebody came along and said, oh, you're a billionaire, right? The poor person might say, you're insane, right? Like, leave me alone. I have to go work for some minimal amount. I have to get to my job or I'll starve, Or they might say, I don't have time to think about that. I have to get to work, right? I have to go I have to go beg, or I have to do something, right? I don't have time to think about what you're saying. I'm adding this part now, that part, because I think that's us. That's my point, right? Like, because what would happen if you, like, if you saying with that metaphor, right? If the person actually believed, like, so if somebody came along and said you have a source of inexhaustible wealth under your floorboards and you just have to dig for a few minutes, you'll get to it, for a little while, you'll get to it. If you felt certain that person were telling the truth, right? If you're that poor person, if you felt certain that person was telling the truth, nothing could stop you, right? Like, there is from uncovering it. But that's not what we do, so we must not believe, right? Or we must think we're too busy or something, right? And so I think it's an interesting metaphor to stay with, or an interesting simile, right? So let's stay with it for a couple more minutes. Oh, one more point. The dirt that covers, in Maitreya's text, he says, the dirt that's covering the inexhaustible treasure is our own mental afflictions and mental obscurations. That's what hides it, right? So the floorboard and the dirt are our own mental afflictions and mental obscurations that are in our minds that stop us from seeing our Buddha nature. So the idea behind that, this simile and this teaching on Buddha nature is obviously a hopeful one, isn't it? It's one that's suggesting, and it's actually we'll talk about that. Honestly, it's suggesting that you have this amazing potential, right, inside of you, that's accessible and solve your that would resolve your suffering. Let's put it that way. That's the way to put it, right? That's what Maitreya is actually saying. It would resolve the suffering that you experience if you were to uncover that. And yeah, before I go on, because I'll talk a little bit about what is Buddha nature and so on. But what I want to ask each of us to do for a moment is to try to feel into this simile, like, so to see, is there a sense in which I'm impoverished? And slowing down for a moment, because what does it mean, actually? Oh, sure, go ahead.
So the simile makes a lot of sense, and the dirt over the jewels and whatever. That's where I'm kind of like a little stuff is floorboards. I mean, floorboards have failed, they're deliberate, they're formidable, I mean, it's kind of like hopeless.
Actually, that's good. You made an interesting point, because actually, read the verse. I actually think I added the floorboards. It's set in this is set. It actually, when Maitreya wrote this text, right, a long time ago. Actually, it's interesting. Maitreya wrote it in Tushita Thurland, but I'll actually read the verse because maybe I added the floorboards. So the verse is: suppose beneath the ground, within a poor person's house, there were an inexhaustible treasure. The person does not know of it. Also, the treasure cannot say, I am here. And he says, similarly, the precious treasure enclosed within the mind, the stainless suchness, neither established nor negated. By not recognizing it, poverty-like suffering of many aspects will constantly be experienced by these living beings. So it actually doesn't mention floorboards. That's probably my own cultural imposition, right? Because in India, there aren't necessarily floorboards. Yeah, so that was my own, my unfortunate cultural imposition on an Indian text.
So the floorboards could be symbolic of ego, which is nailed by it. Pretty formidable. Yeah, and you have to take them out with or without the names.
Well, and what you're both getting at is that whether we think of it as dirt or we think of it as floorboards, is it takes effort to uncover our Buddha nature. That's for sure. Truly, it's not an effortless. It doesn't just happen. You have to uncover it. That's a true statement. Well, and actually, I was thinking of that. Also, you have to know where to look too, don't you? And actually, that's a good transition. So maybe I'll say I wanted to sort of contemplate something together, because this teaching on Buddha nature is actually saying that each of our deepest nature is our Buddha nature. And the question that you're raising of where to look, I think, is an interesting one, because it's good to think about for a moment, and this is getting at why don't we uncover it for. So I want to ask to contemplate together. Actually, I'll start with a very simplistic question, which is very complicated. It's simple and it's complicated, right? Ask yourself for a moment, who am I? And if you think about, like, in most of the time in your day-to-day life, even if you're not asking that question, right, there's some sense of who am I that motivates, that's there as you're going about your day, right? And actually, there are a lot of different, there are all these different roles that we're in at times, aren't there? Like, I'm a, my profession, right? Or are you, at a given moment, are you a son or a daughter, right? Are you a friend? Are you an employee or a boss? Are you a mother or a father? Or you, whatever? All the endless, right? I'm a driver. I'm a walker. I'm a whatever. All these different identities that we interact based upon, and also our nationality, our gender, our right. If you this morning, I was talking to somebody, and they were saying like it was. So I was talking about walking to work, and this woman was talking about walking to work, and she was saying she was talking about the shoes she had to put on, good for work, and I was like, oh, gender, like that. One thing I don't worry about it as much about the weird dress shoes, I guess, but not they don't present the problem hers do. On a walk to work, right? So gender becomes the identity then when she's shopping for shoes. So there are all these identities that change our behavior, right? And that motivate us and that sort of underlie what we're doing. So who am I? Right? If you ask that question, am I one of those? And what do those identities lead to? Right? When I think of myself according to nationality or gender or whatever it may be, right? All these different roles I'm in. They change our behavior, right? One point, though, is that actually, well, I'll ask first, in what sense are you that, right? We're not saying you're not those things, right? But in what sense are you those things? In what sense are you a professional or a male or a female or a whatever, citizen of this country or whatever, we could go on and on. Actually, you could make up an infinite list of identities, couldn't you? I live in this town, I live in this street. And each of those at a certain moment becomes relevant, doesn't it? If you were somewhere strange, isn't it? Like, they become only in certain contexts, they become relevant, don't they? Like if you're in a, I don't know, if you're in another country and then you say, oh, I live in Virginia, and then you come across somebody who's in Virginia. Oh, that seems amazing, right? Oh, you live in Virginia. Of course, if you're in Virginia, then it's not amazing at all. It doesn't matter. It seems irrelevant. And where you grew up, right? If you bump into somebody who is from that town, suddenly that seems, oh wow, that's remarkable. You've been to that town, or you've been to that street or something, On the other hand, it's not. When we're growing up there, first that didn't seem terribly important. The point is, you could make up an infinite number of different identities for yourself, and you are those things, right? But in what sense are you those things? And what Buddhism is pointing out, one point, it's actually there, is in Buddhism, is that, how do you say it, right? The phrase they often use is, you exist as that merely labeled by the mind, right? So it's just a label. It's just, in other words, based on some causal factors, you can label and say, I'm this, right? And if you label in that way, and it's not, you could make up some label that's not true. If you say I'm a rhinoceros, that's a label that's not valid. But if you say you're a person, that's a valid label, right? You can say whatever. You can make up different labels, right? But none of those, the point I'm getting at here is none of those are your final nature. They are all sort of labeled identities that exist contextually, that exists interdependently. in some sense. And they really only exist based on concepts, right? So if you say I'm from Virginia, right? Well, Virginia was actually Virginia itself, right? Was made up, wasn't it? It was sort of somebody drew the lines, right? They discussed it, and they debated, and then they labeled it a certain name, which wasn't named that before, won't be named that forever, right? So it's conceptual, right? And all those other ones are also conceptual. Um, anyway. So so who am I? And what we're getting at here, one is, so we have lots of identities. They're all contextual. They all exist conceptually. Now, what the teachings on Buddha nature are suggesting is that at the deepest level, your nature is Buddha nature. Is a Buddha, or sometimes Buddha nature actually isn't the right. That's the term we use in English. Actually, that was used, has been used, but actually, in Maitreya's text, he uses this term Tathagata Garbha. So Tathagata means like they usually translate it one gone thus, or gone to reality, or gone to enlightenment, thus gone. And then Garba is like seed, or could sometimes translate it as womb, or sometimes translated as source or essence. So you could say the essence of one gone thus is your deepest nature. I'll call it Buddha nature though, but it's just that's the. And again, what we're getting at here, right, is like, so if we're looking at, so where do you look, right? Point, right? Where do you look for the treasure? And part of what I'm getting at is if you stay focused on any one of those identities, you won't find your Buddha nature, right? So, in other words, if you stay focused on this or on that, whatever they give, right? That's not the place where you'll find your Buddha nature. And actually that's obvious, because what will you find in any of those identities? You'll find some mix of, sometimes just suffering, sometimes a mix of happiness and suffering. Depends on the moment and on the identity. But actually, it's true though, isn't it? And there is whatever you identify, if you identify with any of those things, right? Because what was that quote I read? Or used the phrase that Maitreya used. He said, similarly, with the precious treasure enclosed within the mind, the stainless suchness, either established or negated, then he said, this is the part again, by not recognizing it, poverty-like suffering of many aspects will constantly be experienced by these living beings. So that's us, right? These living beings is us. And what he's getting at there, to some extent, is as long as we are caught up in focusing our attention, our mental attention, right? Because it's in the mind, he says. And as long as we're focused on giving our mental attention to other identities, poverty like suffering of many aspects will continually be experienced by these living beings. And I want to ask us just to contemplate that, right? Because he's not getting at something terribly esoteric here. What he's getting at is like, it's true, isn't it? In other words, you have certain kinds of sometimes temporary pleasure, but whatever you identify with also comes with complexity, doesn't it? And problems. I'll just give a simplistic example. I didn't pick any of these. I'll give the simplistic example, right? Parent, right? That's one identity, right? And ordinarily we associate that one with great joy, right? gives, often does when they have someone has a new baby, say congratulations. And at the same time, that identity comes with also a lot of stress, a lot of challenges. There's a quote in a Sutra of Golden Light, where the Buddha's they're remembering the past life of the Buddha, where the Buddha gave his life for the tigress, famous story. But where the Buddha in a past life gave his life to a tigress to feed her cubs, But then in that sutra, his father says that after that person died, his father says the joy of a father upon the birth of a son does not equal the pain of a father and the death of a son. Which I always stuck in my mind because I've sat with people when they're grieving a child. It's true. Horrifying, suffering, right? So there is no identity conventionally that comes without certain kinds of risks of suffering. Is the point, right? And we don't have control over those risks, do we? Father didn't want to lose his son. And if you identify with a certain country, that can be wonderful. But then if the country has socio-political problems, goes to war, then all kinds of suffering can come with that identity, and so on. And there's no conventional identity that doesn't include, as Maitreya says, various kinds of suffering. And what he's suggesting here is, he's not saying that those identities don't exist, right? He's also not saying don't identify with them. He's saying, if you want to find this source of inexhaustible treasure, then look for your Buddha nature, this Tathagata, this hidden within the mind. So it's not under your floorboards or under your dirt, whichever way you want to translate that. It's in your mind, as he says, right? The precious treasure enclosed within the mind. And then he says, the stainless suchness, right? So what's he saying? He's saying, and actually this is getting at, there are actually two types of, in this philosophical sense, there are two types of Buddha nature. I'll explain those briefly. One is your naturally abiding Buddha nature, and the other is what they call your developing Buddha nature. So I want to say, he's getting here at the naturally abiding. When he says the stainless suchness, he's getting at your naturally abiding Buddha nature. And what he's saying is stainless suchness means emptiness. It's the nature. Suchness means the suchness, the way it actually abides. So what he's getting at there is the ultimate nature of your mind is your Buddha nature. And this is important, it's taught in the text, and I think it's important to contemplate. The ultimate nature of your mind is sometimes in Buddhism described as clear light. And they say it's can never be stained. That and they use this metaphor sometimes. They say, if you look at the sky, there could be all kinds of clouds, there could be storms, there could be smoke, as there has been this year. None of those can ultimately stain space. It's a better translation here. Right? Nothing can stain space, because space by its nature is actually, in Buddhism, space is unobstructedness, right? That allows things to arise. In a similar way, our mind's nature can never be stained, can never be polluted. Pollution can arise within it, but it can't be polluted, if that makes sense. In the sense that mental afflictions can arise in the mind, but they never become the nature of the mind. So you could have hatred, for example, it's a mental affliction, but your mind never becomes the nature of hatred. They call it adventitious. That's the term they often use, meaning it just arises temporarily, right? But it's not in the nature of the mind. It's a temporary arising that obscures the mind. Now we're getting at the dirt, right? That's the dirt. So your deepest nature is this stainless potential. I just want to pause there, and I want to ask, if we focus on mind, focus on person, to contemplate that now for a moment. Like, so to imagine, that we've used different images and different metaphors, but I could talk more philosophically about it, but that's not the point today, I think. So what I want to ask us to do is to pause and to contemplate something, which is like, so Maitreya is saying, right, that hidden beneath the dirt, is the relief to my poverty, that hidden within my mind, unseen by me, is this clear light nature, this Buddha potential, this suchness, which means, right, which is my potential for enlightenment. And what I want to ask you to do is to actually just contemplate that for a moment and notice, how do you feel? Like what comes up for you? The idea that you personally have this, first of all, this nature, your deepest nature, right? We were talking, this is why I asked about the identities before, right? We're familiar with these other identities, right? This is a deeper identity, according to is what's being asserted. That your deepest nature, your deepest thing to identify with, is unstained, can never be, never was, and never can be harmed, and is an infinite potential, a limitless potential for, we'll get into for one in a minute, but just for now, just leave it as enlightenment. That's the most important. That's the deepest, is your deepest nature, and it's the most important one to identify with. And notice what comes up for you as you try to be present with that assertion, which is actually an assertion that the Buddha made. The Buddha said that about you. And all your other identities that you've had in your life were like passing clouds. I mean, ever changing, temporary. But this stainless suchness, this Buddha nature, is like sky itself, unchanging, ever present, and is your hidden nature. Well, to ask folks, just to you don't have to, but if you want to, if you're willing, if you're open, if you feel like, is just to share what's your actual experience in relation to this assertion of the Buddha, that's your deepest nature, and the one, and the nature that's particularly worth focusing on. It's the place to look if you want to find your treasure. That's what I'm saying. I mean, anybody wants to share it, okay. Like, I'm curious if people go, that seems far-fetched, or that's what I've always known, or I don't know.
I feel joyful. I feel optimistic. I see a light at the end of the tunnel. That's what I see.
Good.
It's probably the deepest place where you can go and park yourself, saying, "Hey, things are not working out. You still have a Buddha." It's a good optimism. That's what I think.
Gives optimism. People
There's a
here.
positive aspect to the practice, I would say.
Good. Other. Anybody?
Yeah, I kind of feel like secure, like a secure place to be in. And there's no all the identities are like a moving and changing about how you can like, about the Buddha nature is not like a refuge, like where you can stay. So it feels like a relief.
That's great. Yeah, other people.
I feel that it's very interesting, kind of in the US, and at this moment, I feel like culturally there's a lot of discussions about our categories, like with like issues of like race and gender, and are these rigid or fluid and all these things. And so when I hear these teachings, I just think it's like we're all talking about it right now, and then like this is like an answer to that. And so it feels like it's something I'd been thinking about before, and then it kind of has like a answer. I think it's really interesting. The mix of that secular political discussion and then this kind of very old spiritual tradition that seems to touch on these topics. It's not a new discussion, I guess.
No, not actually. Just to share brief. I won't go too far into this, but actually, well, those issues come up in the Buddhist sutras. There's one funny. If you read in the Vilamakirti Sutra, which is translated into English, there's this beautiful story where Shariputra, who's like a monk, and he's depicted in this. He's actually a great Buddhist arhat, but in this particular sutra, he's depicted as being a little bit formalistic, maybe a little uptight even. I'm not sure if that's something to be sacrilegious to say, but I think that's the way he's depicted. And Vilamakirti is this very unconventional Buddhist master, layperson. And so anyway, there's a goddess who's living with Vilamakirti, and she's quite enlightened being. And Shariputra, who's a little, he starts asking the goddess questions. She's quite wise, and then he says to her, well, if he was patriarchal, I guess you'd say. So he says, well, you're so wise and you have so much good karma. Why don't you become a man? And she says, she gets at Buddha nature. She says, for many years, I've been searching for male or female. I can't find any final referent to either. And then he kind of looks at her confused, and she snaps her fingers, and suddenly it's like a modern movies like this. Suddenly she has his body and he has hers. And so he's female, right? And he gets all uptight, and she says to him, why don't you become male? And he says, he just kind of is flabbergasted, and then she switches back. And she says, male and female are just designations in the end.
It's really funny you bring that up, because I had read that, and that's one of the stories that made me just make that comment.
Yeah,
so
it's a great story.
That's what we'll talk about now.
Yeah, there are quite a few stories like that where they're getting at this point about, that identities are conventionalities. They do exist, but only, what's the word? Only interrelationally and only conceptually, right? But there's no final, actually, because that's the point, right? That's part of the point they're getting at in Buddhist teachings on emptiness is, if something, they actually say that if something's truly existent, it should be findable. Right? Otherwise, it just exists conceptually, right? But if you look for a final, so all these, and it's not saying that, this isn't saying that, that all, same thing, right? Like, whether it's you're saying I'm Virginian, or you're saying I'm male, or you're saying I'm female, or you're saying I'm this race, or I'm this culture, or I'm this nationality, those things all exist conceptually, but there's no final basis, right? If you search subatomic particles looking for maleness or femaleness, you won't find it. So they exist conceptually, but they're not ultimately findable anywhere. And that's what that goddess was getting at, right, when she was pointing out to Shariputra that he was grasping at in his case, gender, as if it were truly existent, which it's not. And she was somebody who was resting in her, as you were putting it, right? She had refuge. She was resting in her Buddha nature in that moment. I guess he wasn't.
You know, when I think of stainless, what comes to mind is this core that you can do. I mean, you can create whatever karma you're going to create, but it's never going to touch that core. The core itself is kind of like weatherproof, you know, so whatever rains down on it or, you know, surrounds it, it's always there to be unearthed, if you will. It takes a while because there's a tonnage on it, but it's there, and that of course creates a level of confidence. And no matter if I'm having a great day or not having a great day, that core, which I have a lot of faith in, that has led me throughout my life towards the truth, it will continue on doing that. I'm very lucky that I have merit that allows that, at least I can get it, kind of thing. You know, I'll go off the days where I go, well, there goes enlightenment because I do something. I go, well, gonna be a while now. But also in terms of identity, I don't know if this has ever happened to anybody here, but my final professional teaching job, I was let go I mean, I was fired basically. And my identity had been so bound up in, I had a nickname, I was part of this institution, never had an institutional identity. I cannot even describe how painful that was when that was ripped. I mean, it was ripped away, and it took me some time because I was so totally, you know, attached to it. I mean, like, you know, like that really intense sticky tape that, you know, you really can't get off. That's what it felt like, being removed. It wasn't like a Band-Aid. It was really painful. And that's when when you speak of identities, I mean, the reality that nothing is permanent, and you know, there is you know, it is a relief, actually, so you don't get that like little tick of identity attached to your, but it's the Dharma is very clear about, you know, the antidotes to things like that, and that is the Buddha. I understand that's the Buddha nature. I guess I have a question about emptiness. How does anyone know, anyone, yeah, high or low, any one human being know that they've arrived at the wisdom that realize, because there's no descriptions of, which is all right, because then those become preconceptions. But it's, how do you know? How do you know when you're the Buddha nature? I mean, how did Buddha know? How did, you know, Siddhartha transforming into Buddha have the confidence to know?
Finding a quote from that one it used to explain. So I don't know if could people online hear the question. She was asking, how does one know when one is seen? Okay, good. Well, there we go. So a few things. One is one point I'll make is according to, well, actually I'll make a few points. Just you were asking, right? How do you know when you seen emptiness, so to speak? Yeah. One point I want to make, or realized emptiness. One point I want to make is that there are different levels of experience. I mean, emptiness is emptiness is the final nature of things, so it is what it is.
Right.
There aren't emptiness is it's that nature, right? So it's not like there are different final natures of things,
Right.
but there are different levels of realization. Is one part. And so according to one simple way to, well, actually, yeah, so I'll say it this way, like actually in the teachings on valid cognition in Buddhism. So how because that's what we're getting at. How does it actually, it's interesting, epistemology, really. How does the one know what one knows? Is the question.
Right.
And according to the Buddhist teachings on valid cognition, there's a well, actually, there are two different ways to list it. One is there's a first way of knowing emptiness that comes through hearing, like through listening to somebody else's explanation. That is a kind of beginning of knowing something, right? It's the first way we start to know about it. And then for okay, so I'll go through that. It's kind of an interesting topic, I think. So in Buddhist teachings on valid cognition, what they get at is, first there's an absolutely not knowing, right? Using the example of emptiness. Then there's where one has heard about emptiness and one thinks it's not the nature of reality, but one starts to have a doubt. Then there's a doubt that's equal, where you say, maybe things are empty, maybe they're not, as you're listening to a teaching, for example, right? Then there's a doubt where you're thinking, I think things are that way. Aryadeva, who's one of the great teachers of emptiness in Buddhist, ancient Indian Buddhist thought, said when one gets to that level, doubt leading into the correct direction, he says, that kind of doubt tears samsara to shreds, which is very powerful. So he says that's actually a very powerful level of knowing, but it's still doubt, actually.
Right.
After that comes a kind of what they call correct supposition.
Mm-hmm.
That's where one has thought about it enough. Now you're starting to get into a wisdom that arises from contemplation, where now you're not just listening, you're actually thinking, is it true or not? How would I know? I'm going to analyze it. I'm going to check. Actually, you can do that through those levels of doubt to some extent. But then there comes a point where you have a kind of, through thinking deeply about it, you come to a conclusion. I really think it seems clear that things are empty, but you haven't yet realized it in a kind of way that's, they call it incontrovertible. In other words, it's still mostly because you heard it. Maybe you heard it from somebody who's a very good, you heard the Dalai Lama teach on it, you got kind of convinced, and you think, oh, that seems true, and you've thought a lot about it. So you kind of have, I really think that's true. That is the nature of things. But you haven't yet seen it through your own reasoning in a way that's
Okay.
not yet, where your own reasoning has proved it to yourself, if that makes sense.
Right,
Where you say,
yes.
I now see that this, and there comes a point that's where it's now this is where they call it a correct or valid inferential cognition. That's where through your own reasoning you've understood the nature of things.
Oh, okay.
That's what they really call the first level of realizing emptiness. And about that, shared now, Lama Tsongkhapa himself says, it's a certain line. He describes the experience here. So I'll read a few verses by Lama Tsongkhapa where he describes the experience of that. He says, one who sees the cause and effect of all phenomena, of both samsara and the state beyond sorrow, nirvana, as forever unbetraying. Right? So first of all, the person is seeing that things exist causally and interdependently, right? And for whom any object trusted in by the grasping mind has completely disappeared, has at that time entered the path pleasing the Buddhas. So he's saying in this experience, right, one understands, one is in a state where one is understanding how things exist interdependently and causally. And then one enters, as he's describing it, for whom any object trusted in by the grasping mind. So all the identities of self and objects that we usually grasp at have completely disappeared.
Hmm.
So they disappear into a kind of what they call a non-affirming negation, a space-like equipoise, a space-like experience. He says, if the appearance of dependent relation, which is unbetraying, is accepted separately from emptiness, as long as they are seen as separate, one is not yet realized the Buddha's intent. If these two realizations are happening simultaneously without alternation, and from merely seeing dependent relation as completely unbetraying, the definite ascertainment comes that completely destroys the way all objects are apprehended as truly existent. At that time, the analysis of the ultimate view is complete. So that's his description of the experience that you're asking about.
Is that in the Lam Rim or is that?
That's in his short. Yeah, it's in his short. He wrote a short Lam Rim prayer called Three Principal Aspects of the
Okay.
Path, and those verses come from that short Lam Rim. And so, what he's getting at there, though, is like that. Actually, he's getting it. So the experience is said to be, or as long as on copper, right? That one is seeing how things are interdependent and are dependently arisen, and then one, by seeing that very clearly, what actually happens is I'll say it this way, actually, to go through the actual process. You've identified actually, because empty means empty of an object of negation, we call it. Like there's something we grasp at that doesn't really exist. So what happens is you see, wow, I'm grasping, where he says grasping, right? Use this term, I'm grasping mind. So actually what happens is you see how your mind grasps, I'm use the example of a self, right? So let's say I see how my mind grasps at an intrinsically, independently, inherently existent self. And then I see there is no such self, because the only self that exists as a mere designation upon merely appearing interdependent factors. Right? And so then what he's describing is that object you grasp at and the mind that grasps at it, right, as a truly existent, independent one, fall away. And there's this experience of, as you say it, of any object trusted in by the grasping mind has completely disappeared. So there's an experience of like, that's the emptiness experience, where one is in this kind of state of seeing emptiness in that sense. And then, though, without alternation, he says, when one comes out of that experience of kind of empty, realizing that the thing we were grasping at, that existence is empty of having that exist at all, one again sees interdependence. So that there's this kind of experience that interdependence is the meaning of emptiness, and emptiness is the meaning of interdependence. But and that, so he describes that. He says that's what the experience is. And he says until we've experienced it in that way, we haven't yet realized the actual intent of the Buddha, the reading of emptiness.
Mm-hmm.
And so and I guess we say this. So that's and what he's getting at here, Lama Tsongkhapa, is that's the final nature of all things, right? Is there emptiness in that sense? And then the how do they call it, the naturally abiding Buddha nature that I mentioned earlier, that is the emptiness of your own mind, right? So all things are empty. One of the things that is empty, that exists, is your own awareness, right? Your own consciousness. And what Buddhism is asserting is that the ultimate nature, the emptiness of your mind, is your, what they call it, naturally abiding, unstained suchness, Buddha nature. So like the emptiness of a cup or a table is not Buddha nature, it's emptiness.
Right.
But the ultimate nature, the emptiness of your consciousness, your awareness, your mind, that's your naturally abiding Buddha nature. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Any questions about that?
Yeah.
Well, any comments? I want to make sure any comments or questions from folks. Oh, John. Yeah, John Muecki. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thanks for bringing up that quote from Lama Tsongkhapa. I think that's just extraordinarily dense in meaning, you know.
Yep.
But you know, one thing that occurs to me too, I really enjoyed studying about the 5 paths, and you know, in the second path of preparation, where you're preparing your mind intellectually to understand emptiness, and finally moving toward experiencing it directly. They talk about that peak level of the path of preparation, whereby you have a direct experience of dependent origination, and that you're no longer deceived by the you know, what appears to be the inherent existence of things. You perceive that your mind is actually creating those appearances, and that they're all just conventional, that they don't have any ultimate reality. And then you know, one of my lamas was describing that process in a very effective way. At least it deeply impressed me, saying that classically speaking, that when practitioners are in that experience, they're urgently motivated to sit in deep meditation and thereby enter the path of seeing, whereby appearances, you know, as you were saying from that quote, appearances just blink out of existence. They just disappear, and you experience voidness directly. And so I think that, you know, with regard to the question that was originally posed, that must be just such an extraordinary experience, you know, when appearances just blink out and you experience emptiness directly. And then coming back down out of that, which, as I understand, typically that experience in the path of seeing lasts about 20 minutes or so. And then you come out of that and appearances reappear, but the mind is no longer deceived by the notion that they have independent existence apart from the mind creating them. And then that long process on the path of habituation, that 4th path of you know, moving toward the complete eradication of the deception that they do exist that way, because they keep appearing to exist that way, right? And then that stage that Lama Tsongkhapa talks about, where you're no longer toggling between, you know, the mind being deceived and the mind not being deceived when appearances blink out of existence, that they somehow coalesce. And I imagine that must be the 5th path of no more learning, where you're no longer toggling back and forth. But you know, maybe a bit of speculation there on my part, but it's really hard for me to get my mind around the notion of that unified coalescence of emptiness and things nonetheless appearing. But you know, from what I've heard in my teachings, you know, that apparently is the mind of a Buddha, which, you know, for as long as we are deceived by the appearance of things, that's very hard to grasp.
Well,
Yeah, but anyway, I get back to that question you originally posed about, you know, how the teachings on Buddha nature touch us. And I can say in my experience, you know, just very, very deeply. I mean, I feel inspiration and longing, and also a determination, you know, not to squander the opportunity of a precious human rebirth. And coupled with that determination, a lot of frustration, you know, by the fact that I am so ensnared, you know, by the, you know, conventional senses of myself. And, yeah, well, that's all I have to say, but except for thank you for bringing this together. And if it is possible, just maybe a little bit of housekeeping, but the camera is aimed kind of when you're speaking to the persons who I assume are in the audience, but it's aimed at your profile. Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
okay. I'll try to move it. Maybe over next time we can even rearrange it a little bit or something, make it better. Well, and first of all, thank you, John. It's good. Thank you for what you shared. And I'll just make a couple of quick comments, because one thing I think John helped me remember is that what you actually elaborate on the answer to that question, which is after, there's, so one level of realization is this correct inferential, right? Or you using your own reasoning through the power of your own mind, you come to understand emptiness. That's what Lama Tsongkhapa is describing here. And then, as John mentioned, then there comes a point where one that can happen. Actually, and one point I'll make is, according to Buddhist teachings, any ordinary person can have that experience. Whereas if you contemplate enough, then you can realize emptiness. And that's not. And then there comes a point where one, as John was mentioning, where you can the second path he was talking about, which is the path of preparation. That's where one has achieved calm abiding. Meditation, and one conjoins calm abiding and special insight. So if you've realized emptiness previously, you now develop a kind of mind of deep meditative concentration called calm abiding, and then you use that to absorb your mind and understanding of this. That's a deeper experience. And then, as John was mentioning, from that path, you eventually reach the level of what they call the path of seeing, where now it's no longer just an inferential cognition, but you see emptiness directly or nakedly. There are different translations of the term, but basically directly. There was a direct perception as so the one is an inferential cognition. We can have those, like, for example, if you see billowing smoke coming from a house and hear fire engines, there's fire happening, right? You can have that kind of inferential. That's different than seeing the fire directly.
Yes.
Here in the path of seeing, as John was mentioning, you see emptiness directly. And that has a more powerful transformative effect. And then you continue to meditate on that to enlightenment. There are deeper experiences of emptiness than just the inferential, as John.
Yeah, no, that I understand the ultimate, but.
And one other point, John, from what you said is, John was making a point too, and I just to address what you said, that I think there are two different points, and I want to mention differentiate them. One is that only a Buddha, as you were, I think, hinting at, John, or saying, I guess, only a Buddha can both simultaneously have a direct perception of emptiness while perceiving conventional appearances. But I don't think that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at in this text. I think he's getting it. So there's an experience that's unique to Buddhas, where they can simultaneously, they have an omniscient mind that can see all phenomena at once, and at the same time they can see the ultimate nature of phenomena. Here, I think what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at, where he says, is that one comes to a conclusion experientially that dependent arising. Remember, I once said this. I said, I asked Gyubei Khyentse this question. I said, is dependent arising what leads to the understanding of emptiness, or is it a synonym for emptiness? And he said it's a synonym. There's dependent arising is the meaning of emptiness, and emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising. And so what he was getting, that even at the level of what I think what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at here is, even at the level of inferential cognition, there's an insight into how dependent arising and emptiness have the same meaning. So you don't have to be a Buddha to realize that, of course. That's a different. So I mean, those are two different. I think probably the Buddha's realization is a different. Obviously, it's a very different level of understanding that experientially. But what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is that that one understands them to be synonyms, dependent. And the Dalai Lama often points it out. He says, what's the word? If you understand deeply enough the meaning of dependent, right, then it cuts off inherent existence, right? And if you understand the meaning of arising, it cuts off nihilism. So it's that kind of understanding that I think Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at. Actually, there's a final verse there that he says that. He says, furthermore, appearance, actually Lama Tsongkhapa says that, furthermore, appearance eliminates the extreme of existence, and emptiness eliminates the extreme of non-existence. if you, by the and if you realize how emptiness manifests in the manner of cause and effect, then you're not captivated by the wrong notions holding extreme views. So he's getting further. And I don't know if you noted, I'll just point out, there's a beautiful thing about that verse, which is he says, if you notice it, he says, appearance eliminates the extreme of inherent existence, right? And emptiness eliminates the extreme of non-existence. Usually you would think the opposite. You would think emptiness should eliminate the extreme of as if things are intrinsically existent, and appearance should eliminate the idea that things don't exist at all, right? Lama Tsongkhapa flips it here. He says, if you really understand appearance, then you won't grasp an inherent appearance. If you really understand the meaning of emptiness, then you will know emptiness doesn't mean nihilism. It doesn't mean things don't exist at all, right? So he flips the ordinary presentation, and he's saying, if you really understand it, then you'll understand it in that way, which is quite profound. But I want to be sure to touch on one more point, and then if there are other questions too. I mean, there's lots more to talk about, but I want to make one more point here, not to leave out for today. Well, actually, two more points. But one is, oneself has Buddha nature, and in his text, one point that Maitreya makes many points, but one of them that's interesting is, I'll do the same thing just for a moment to pause and reflect. Because we also relate to others through we relate to others through our sense of who we identify them as. So, sometimes, and in general, most of the time, we relate to others through what I would say is Buddhism says is identities that are exaggerations, right? Like, if somebody doesn't do what we like, then we identify them as the annoying person. If somebody does do what we like, we say they're great, and so on. And we kind of sometimes we flip back and forth, don't we? And also, we have all these, as you were making a point about in our culture now, we're sort of exploring some people are exploring those kind of questions, but like, how do our different ways we identify people relate to biases and prejudices and so on, and judgments and things like that. And one point that Maitreya is making is, if you have Buddha nature, if that's the final nature of your mind, that's also the final nature of everyone else's mind. And so one point that Maitreya is making, and does make in his text, is he says, well, he doesn't say it this way, I'll say it this way. So what happens if you start to relate to others as though who they are in the way that is most deeply significant is future Buddhas or Buddha nature, and I make a point here. When I say others in this sense, it doesn't only mean human, of course, right? In other words, an ant has Buddha nature, right? Every ant has consciousness or awareness, it's a sentient being, right? So, and that consciousness, its ultimate nature is emptiness. So the ant also has the authority, what we call it, the naturally abiding Buddha nature. Every cat and dog, every fly, every mosquito. And again, what would happen if you viewed, just asking it as a contemplation, right? If you viewed every other person and every non-person, every non-human person, whatever we say, saying, temporarily is this, temporarily this being's an ant, but its final nature is Buddha nature. Temporarily this mosquito is a mosquito, but its final nature is Buddha nature. Temporarily this person I disagree with is somebody I'm disagreeing with. Their final nature is Buddha nature.
So does something ants and mosquitoes have choices?
Sure.
If I can sting you or not?
Sure. Well, and they have choices. I guess what I would argue is they have choices like we have choices. Which means, actually, if you check your own experience, right? Just like check your own experience, right? Ultimately, you always have choices, but sometimes on a practical level you do and sometimes you don't, isn't it? Like, in other words, in the sense that if you check your own experience, right? Sometimes your conditioning or my conditioning, I'm not singling you out, particularly all of us, same in this way. Sometimes our conditioning is so strong that even though in theory I have a choice, I actually can't make that choice, because I'm so conditioned to respond, like, so for example, if, I don't know, if somebody has very strong conditioning to reacting angrily and haven't worked on it, and then somebody walks up to them and says something insulting, without any choice, they get angry, right? They don't think I want to get angry. Ultimately, that's a choice in the sense that you can condition yourself differently, and then you won't react that way. Any of us can do that if we try hard enough, right? So what I would argue is a mosquito is the same in that sense. Ultimately, they do have a choice. Obviously, there are moments where their conditioning could be so strong, but just like us, they don't have a choice in that moment. But it's just because of conditioning. But ultimately, yes, they have a choice. But we're all sometimes.
Just can't rebel ants. You're an ant, you gotta be an ant. You gotta do what an ant does. I mean, how much they're gonna give us, like, no, I'm not gonna do that. They, how much, I don't know, see their choice.
Well, it's just like literally, like, right, and mosquito, like, actually, I don't know how they choose, no idea what their conscience is like, but if you're sitting, actually, you've seen, like, sometimes mosquito lands and somebody doesn't bite them. Sometimes the mosquito's between two people and it goes towards one and not the other. And if you watch ants, right, sometimes they go this way and sometimes they go that way, and they don't all act the same exactly. If you tap the table, one will go this, one will do one thing and one will do another. That's because of their conditioning in whatever way. And but I guess at one point they make, actually, the Buddhist teachings, though, is that in general, I guess you can say this way, that what you're getting at, I think, is an important, there's a deeper implication to it, which is it's actually interesting, isn't it, to think about, like, one is, I guess I'm think of two different points. One is the human realm is the realm where one has the most choice. It's not the most pleasurable, according to Buddhism. The human realm is not the most pleasant realm to be in, but it is a realm in which we have more choices, because of the nature of our awareness. But I'm going to elaborate on this for a second, because one of the sufferings of samsara, though, is that our choices, the more liberated we become from samsara, or you could say, the more choices we have. And one of the sufferings of samsara is the limitation of our choices. And I'll go back to your point about refuge, that Buddha nature is a refuge, right? Because what strikes me is, like, if you've identified deeply with your Buddha nature, right, that doesn't die. So even as you're dying, you lose all, you were saying when you lost a job, and I was thinking about that. I was like, well, actually, eventually we lose whatever identity we have. If it's not the nature of mind, then we're eventually going to lose it, and that will be painful, if we're grasping it, and to varying degrees depending on how much we grasp it. And but if what you've identified with is your Buddha nature, well, that goes with you, because consciousness continues, so in that sense, like, somebody who's identified with their Buddha nature deeply, seen their Buddha nature, they even have choice at death. Not, like, they can actually choose where they go next, for example. An ant doesn't have that choice. Unfortunately, neither most of us, because we haven't identified with the right thing. So my point is that it's interesting to contemplate, like, because I think there's an implication to what you're saying, which is, like, how does any being give themselves more choices? And that's one way of viewing progress on the path, I think, sometimes. And so I don't know, an ant may have a choice about which grain of sugar does it pick up, I suppose. But it's conditioned to pick up sugar, right? If there's sugar there, to bring it back to its nest or whatever. But it's disturbing, actually. One thing Lama Zopa Rinpoche often used to point out is he used to look at people. I think I I believe he was, he was somebody with a lot of choices. And he would look at people and he would say, wow, they're human, but they're the same as an ant, actually. Like, and there is, like, they don't think they have a choice. They go to work, they come home, they watch TV, they go back to work, they, like, and like, they go through their life and there's no difference. He said they have a precious human life. And he would, like, you could see it was like this visceral experience of looking at people and sort of going, wow, like, they don't feel any, they don't see their freedom. And if you, and I guess that's one point, if you see, to the extent to which we identify our Buddha nature as who we are, we give ourselves choices then, right? Suddenly you go, well, I can do all kinds of things then. It's a kind of freedom. And I think the extent that we don't see that, we get stuck in a role or some other identity, whether it be our identity or our worker identity or our whatever, we get some idea and we get stuck in that. But if you can see, things about which we think we don't have a choice, we get a choice then. So I just think it's a fascinating question you're raising. But so I mean, of course, like, and they say that in the teachings, right? That beings in the animal realm have fewer choices because, but not none, of course, like, but it's, it's hard actually, isn't it? It's hard to recognize how many choices we have and that we could choose differently. It's hard, like, even just in the moment, right? It's hard in our lifestyle to recognize we have other choices, but it's hard even in the moment, isn't it? A stimulus arises and it's so hard to recognize we have a choice to respond in different ways to that stimulus. Whereas for someone who's realized emptiness at different levels of realization, it becomes easier and easier to recognize choices. And that if you think about the meaning of, there's 3 levels of suffering, the suffering of suffering, the suffering of change, and the suffering of the compounded aggregates, they call it. But the suffering of the compounded aggregates really is that we don't have choice. In other words, that that's one way of describing the meaning of that, is that you're in samsara without choice. That you don't have an ability, to in that moment. You have an ability ultimately, that's why, because you have Buddha nature, right? So anyway, but I do think it's important, I wanted to mention that idea though, like to also contemplate, to view others as beings with Buddha nature, right? As and then would you relate to them differently? It's a question, right? Would you, and of course you would, wouldn't we? If we view others in that way, then we'll relate to them differently. I'll pause there. I could say more, but any comments or questions? Not that you have to.
So I have a question,
Yeah.
piggybacking on the ant situation. Yeah. Would they have intention?
Yeah, according to Buddhism, intention, if you think of like the actual mind and mental factors teachings, intention is said to be one of the they call them, always present. There are different trends, always present mental factors. So and they say intention is like in the mind and mental factors teaching, it says intention is like is similar to like the force of a magnet and an iron, like it pulls, so like according to that teaching, intention is a very basic level of so like if an ant goes towards sugar or goes away from a pounding, like let's say there's the intention, like the intention
Like,
is get away.
I'm hungry is an intention.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, and fear, like so fear, like wanting to escape danger is an intention.
And Dr. Ryan, so would they have all 5 omnipresent, like contact,
Yep.
discrimination, all of that 5?
Yep. Yeah, they would all 5 all the time. Yeah,
But in their own limited ways.
Yeah, it's a different, yes, it's in a very simple, a very basic way, but it's there, yeah. Yeah, and discrimination, like, so for example, if it's quiet and then you pound the table, the ant moves, that's a kind of discrimination, right? And it's a sensation, and then it's a discrimination, where it's discriminating danger, right? Like from another kind of sound. You know, whereas if,
Then the plants wouldn't have that, then.
No.
So according to that description, a tree is not a sentient
it's not, yeah, according to that description, it would be a tree is a living thing, but not a sentient.
living. Thank you.
So were there discussions, like I know Holiness has wonderful discussions with scientists and stuff all the time, and you've been kind of in the forest a lot, and, you know, the organisms are sometimes like huge, like a whole patch of trees is one organism, you know, and things like that. Is there any discussion or thought that perhaps they are sentient beings?
I'll just share my own reflection on that. Like, I mean, the formal sort of way, I mean, you know, on the one hand, Buddhist teachings, I guess, say, you know, the animal realm is a realm of sentient beings, and the, you know, they say, like that, a plant doesn't have consciousness is one point. But then to get to your, like, if you, I want to, this is my own reflection on that now, is, at the same time, like, so the Buddha's, you know, there's, from the time of the Buddha on, right? Like when the Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree and touched the earth, right? And then, you know, Mara was sent his armies and was attacking and so on, right? And the Buddha meditated on love and the armies were overcome, right? And then Mara was like the force of suffering, the cause, you know, force of attachment. It's like, says it tries to block the Buddha from achieving enlightenment. When the Buddha touched the earth, actually, they say the earth goddess arose, right, and said, this being deserves enlightenment. I watched. He's practiced love. He's practiced kindness, lifetime after lifetime. You know, nothing can stop this person from becoming enlightened. So, who was the earth goddess? You know, she was the goddess of the earth. I don't know. You know, like, and if you look in Buddhist teachings and Buddhist scriptures, there are many, like, there are goddesses of trees, you know, and there are gods and goddesses of regions, you know, like Tibetans and Tibetan code. Well, but it's the same in Indian Buddhist scripture. You'll see the same thing where, like, they'll describe like going to a certain place and recognizing there's the goddess of this forest or the god of that mountain, and they'll, you know, just last night I was watching the Dalai Lama was teaching in Ladakh. He's in Ladakh right now. The beautiful clothing that the Ladakhi people were wearing. It's very beautiful. I can see, but they had like these beautiful turquoise clothes on anyway. But it's only because he doesn't talk this way as much when he comes to someplace like when he's teaching to people from Europe or US. But you know, he was in this beautiful natural setting with these mountains around in Ladakh, and he was saying, he went on for a long time talking about like that he was giving a ritual, and then ordinarily there's a certain part of the ritual where the Lama throws mustard seeds and sort of offers a ritual cake and asks interfering beings to leave. You know, like it's a traditional part of the ritual. And his Holiness Dalai Lama said last night was saying, he said, I'm not going to do that. And he said there are all kinds of invisible beings here in Ladakh, you know, like the spirits and the ghosts and the mountain spirits and the regional landlords and he said, and I'm not asking them to leave because I have compassion for them. They're like, if I practice compassion, it's not just for humans, like, and if those beings want to make trouble, then they're suffering. And he said, so please come. You know, he's kind of his point. He was like, he said, I want you to be included in the ritual. I'm not going to ask you to leave. He said, how could I shoo somebody away? That's not, they have Buddha nature also, you know. Actually, he said that. He said all those beings have Buddha nature. And he said, I invite them, actually, kind of thing. I want them to actually hear the Dharma, you know, too, just not just humans. And so, you know, so there's a subtle, so on the one hand, he's not saying the mountain has consciousness, you know, on the other hand, he's saying there's a regional spirit of the mountain that does. So it's a more nuanced, I think, question then, in that sense. And yeah, so actually somebody told me that there's a side story, but I don't know if it's true even. I didn't hear it directly from anybody. But somebody told me that I was there when the Dalai Lama many years ago gave a Kala Chakra initiation at Madison Square Garden in New York, which was a fun event. But and I don't know if this is true, but somebody told me at the time that there were so many invisible beings in New York that like the lamas gathered and they said we need to do extra prayers for them because like we're creating this energy here. We want to also somehow help the spirits of New York. And I was like, New York City has spirits too, is their point. Not just Ladakh, but the Dalai Lama wouldn't talk about that. In Ladakh, he talks about it openly because it's a culture where that's
Right.
part of in New York City, he wasn't going into detail about that. But so anyway, so I think that's a more nuanced way to think about that.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. He recently started doing that, like 2-3 years back.
Yeah.
And I was having a conversation with somebody and said, like, that is probably a reference to a certain level of Buddhahood that you achieved, and therefore it no longer impacts you. Sort of. I don't know how true it is, but I think that's what it's reference to. I tend to believe that personally.
Yeah, because many lamas still do the ritual. I mean, I noticed that most lamas will still do the ritual at the certain part of certain, if there's a text that's teaching a certain ritual of how to give an initiation, most lamas will do it the traditional way. It always leaves that out because he said a different,
Yeah, but only recently though.
Recent years, yeah, he didn't
Yeah.
used to do them.
Wasn't there a controversy with the Dalai Lama when he said we're not going to do this?
Oh, that was a different.
Oh, that was a different.
That's different than this topic. Yeah, we go to that some other time. But that's he did do that, but that was a different question. That was more about sectarianism. That was a question that he raised about a certain practice that he felt was sectarian.
Yeah.
And he was against that. And so he stood up against, even though he was from the Gelugpa tradition and
Right.
the Gelugpas were doing it, he said no, and he said, if you're my student, you can. But nothing sectarian because it goes against the spirit of, which was it's a similar point, but different.
Right.
So is that like him talking in that way in one place but not in another? Is that an example of the idea of the skillful means, where it's not more or less true, it's just that some people would understand it a certain way and other people wouldn't? Is that what that means, like that phrase?
Yeah, skillful means is like that. Yeah, it's what they actually say, like you can see that there are many examples like that, even from the time of the Buddha, like where the Buddha would they often use it that way, like when they talk about skillful. I mean, there are different meanings to skillful means, of course, but in a general sense, it's often described as like you could actually like you can see there are examples in the Buddha's teachings where like somebody would come up and ask a question of the Buddha, and it was very clear that he would, I remember one story where there was a couple of young male students who came along and they were raising questions of caste. They were Indian people who were raising questions of caste. And so then the Buddha started talking about caste, and he sort of was addressed. And it was very, like in the end, what the Buddha sort of, it was interesting. He started by saying, essentially was saying to be Arya is quite important. They were saying it's important to be noble caste, Arya. And then he started redefining what does Arya mean. And he said, but I don't think Arya means who you were born, who your mother and father were. I think it means if you've seen reality or not. And if you've seen the nature of reality, then you're noble. If you haven't, then you're not. So he took their concern, but then used it. So that'd be an example of
using their framework to explain it to them so that they would understand, even though the way they were thinking of it was like wrong in his. Okay.
Yeah, and you can see that I've often, it's pretty clear, like like when and I think it's quite appropriate, isn't it? When His Holiness Dalai Lama meets with scientists, right? He'll talk about particle physics and how that relates to the teachings on emptiness. But if he's teaching in Ladakh, he's probably less likely to do that because it's not a conceptual framework that is as common among that group of people. So I think that you'll see like where and it goes back to the time of the Buddha, whereas the idea is like to present the teaching, but to suit it to the context.
On that one, probably one of the explanation I've heard of is like anything conventional, anything related to the method side. For a person like them, it probably could become a skillful means of seeing that.
Yeah, Yeah, that's another way of saying it, or isn't it? Is that everything that's not wisdom is skillful means. That's another way of defining. If it's not the wisdom, understanding emptiness. That's it. But I guess it's 12:30, so we should stop. And I'll just make one last comment. So you know, that was kind of an introduction to this just concept of Buddha nature. And now Gabe posted to the website a series of classes. So there will be, you know, just want to say in case also for the people online and for those of you here, that this was just kind of an introduction. And then the next series of classes I'll teach on, it'll be like 2 Saturdays a month, will be actually covering chapter 1 of the Uttaratantra, which is Maitreya's text. Anybody's welcome to come to any class or not come, whatever. But and that will be, it'll be a little, I mean, it'll be the same topic, but what we're really going to do is go kind of step by step through his first chapter. And what he describes is the relationship between Buddha nature and refuge, the nature of what are the 3, you know, like actually it's interesting to say Buddha nature, you have to say, what's a Buddha? So he'll describe some things about what is the Buddha, what is the Dharma, what is the Sangha, how does that relate to Buddha nature? And then he goes through many different points about what Buddha nature actually is and different similes and different explanations. So this was kind of an informal kind of introduction to the topic, but what we'll do is now, in next class, I'm going to ask people for feedback about how much detail they want, because we can go in great detail or we can go medium detail. Obviously, it's a chapter, so we're not going to just, I won't just sort of, it'll be somewhat detailed, but I'll ask for, next class, I'll ask for people's feedback about how detailed we want to be, but it'll be actually covering 1 chapter of his text, and that's the most important chapter. It's the longest chapter, so it covers the key points of that. And it's the most, you'd say it's the most popular teaching in the Tibetan tradition on Buddha nature. There are many teachings on Buddha nature, but it's the most well-studied, most commonly studied teaching on Buddha nature in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. But let's just do our dedication and stuff. So actually, rather than doing a chanting kind of thing, I'll just say, let's just dedicate like this, you know, may each of us, you know, who have gathered here today, in person or online, may we have success in identifying and realizing our own Buddha nature. May we be able to see the Buddha nature in others. May we be able to dig up or uncover our Buddha nature. And then in that way, access, using that metaphor, that simile rather, we will be able to access that inexhaustible treasure of spiritual potential in order to then use it for the welfare of ourselves and others. That's a good dedication. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank
you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Stop the recording.
Thank you, Lauren.
But thanks everybody.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.